Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the board and staff of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, I'm excited to welcome you to a panel discussion this afternoon on Promise or Peril in the Smart City, Local Government in the Age of Digital Urbanism. We are pleased to be co-sponsoring this event today with the Innovation Policy Lab, and you'll meet David Wolf, the co-director, at the end of this session. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance here at the Munk School of Global Affairs. Well, there's certainly a lot of buzz around the idea of smart cities. The audience participation today highlights that. You might wonder why an Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance is interested in smart cities. Well, not surprisingly, we are interested in how they impact municipal finances, governance, and service delivery. What types of regulations do cities need to put in place for the relationships with technologists and the private sector? What will be the impact on how local services are delivered? What happens with the data? Who owns it? How involved will the public be in decision-making around the use of new technology? So we're hoping that some of these questions will be addressed in the panel discussion this afternoon. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank the sponsors of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maitrey, the Province of Ontario, TD Bank Group, and the City of Toronto. I would also like to thank our team at IMFG for putting this event together today, Selena Zhang and Jamila Aladina. I'd also like to thank our events staff and the technical staff here at the Munk School. If you are tweeting about this event this afternoon, and we encourage you to tweet about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFG Toronto. So I'm going to turn the proceedings today over to our moderator, who is John Lawrence. Most of you, I think, know John, or certainly have heard about him if you haven't seen him. He writes about urban affairs, business, and local history for publications such as the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, Walrus, and Spacing, where he is a senior editor. John is also the Toronto nonfiction editor for Coach House Books and is currently co-editing an anthology about archaeology in The Ward to be published this spring. Little plug there for John. Please welcome our moderator for today, John Lawrence.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this invitation, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I think you'll find it very stimulating. We're going to have 4 speakers. We're going to have some discussion amongst the speakers and then open up the floor to questions. At that point, I'll call on you to ask questions, make very brief remarks, and I'll invoke my privilege as a journalist to interrupt you at any time. The phrase smart city is one of those great terms that the likes of me enjoy, because it can really it means all sorts of things to all sorts of people. It's quite nebulous, and hopefully we'll have some very practical understandings of it at the end of this session. I just wanted to tell a very brief story from a piece I wrote for the Globe several years ago that kind of illustrates something about this concept. So I ended up doing a piece about data and data analytics and the use of all this large tranches of data for the Globe and Mail, and ended up talking to a guy who was working for Michael Bloomberg, who was then the mayor of New York. And this was a man named Mike Flowers, who was from Brooklyn, and he had a fantastic career. He'd been an intelligence officer in Iraq and was a lawyer and worked in the DA's office and ended up being in charge of analytics for Bloomberg's, for the office of the mayor. And he was trying to operationalize what Bloomberg made his fortune doing, which is finding meaning and significant meaning in numbers and information. And so one of the things that he was trying to do is work with all the incredible amount of data that cities produce and find meaning and find applications for that data. And so he was in this long process of creating a humongous spreadsheet that contained all the municipal addresses in New York City and populating it with just about every piece of information about each address, and then looking at what you could do to query that huge database and figure out things you could learn about the city that you didn't know. And one of his focuses was on fire trap housing. And was it possible, if you queried the data in the right way and looked for the right sorts of patterns, could you predict where fires might occur? And this is a really important task that municipalities have to undertake, right? Municipalities spend a lot of money fighting fires, and predicting fires would be a much better, safer, and humane way of addressing that issue. So he was querying the data, he was studying it, and he had his data analytics people looking at it, and then he was trying to test predictions. So they were sort of looking for different patterns, and then trying to test it against particular addresses that had fires. And so he ended up going out with a bunch of building inspectors for the city of New York. And this guy, by the way, had a fantastic New York accent, which I'm not going to parrot. But he spent 3 days with New York City building inspectors, who are exactly what you would imagine, trying to sort of determine whether the predictions that the data in this huge spreadsheet, whether they could accurately predict fires that had occurred. And at one point, he pulls up to a building, and the building inspector takes one look at the building, which had turned up on their list of likely places for a fire. And the guy said, "Nah, there's not going to be a fire here." And so they kind of did a deep dive on on what they knew about that address. And it turns out that there had been recently a building permit applied for by the building owner. And what the inspector knew at visual inspection was he had noticed that the bricks on the building had been recently repointed. And that was evidence that that this building was being cared for and likely not a fire trap. And what I like about this story is that it kind of combines analytics and all the stuff that you could do with software and large data sets with this sort of human understanding. And to my mind, it represents a kind of the sort of high water mark. When we're talking about smart cities, we want to acknowledge the fact that there's this huge amount of technology that can be applied to making cities more efficient and moving traffic better and finding leaking water mains using sensors and all of that sort of thing, but doing it in a way that acknowledges that cities are basically human places full of buildings. And so I think that we're going to get into a lot of that with the speakers today. I'm going to very briefly introduce them. They all have excellent resumes, and I'm not going to go over all the details, but I'm going to bring them up in order. So Tracey Cook over here, she's been the Executive Director of Municipal Licensing and Standards for the City of Toronto since 2012. You've probably read about Tracey because she's been very involved in Uber and the Airbnb regulation. She's the recipient of the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal, and in 2016 was named Toronto Life's 13th most influential person in the city. Zachary Spicer is a visiting researcher with the Institute of Municipal Finance and Governance. He was an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Brock University. He's recently published a number of journal articles, and his first book, The Boundary Bargain, Growth, Development, and the Future of City-County Separation, was recently published by McGill Queen's. Pamela Robinson is an associate professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning and the associate dean of graduate studies at Ryerson University. She's been working with federal government on their open data policies and is involved in some of the smart city initiatives and the discussions around that. And finally, Peter Sloly, also somebody whose name you've probably seen in the press. He currently leads Deloitte's Security and Justice Practice to modernize and optimize Canada's police, courts, corrections, national security agencies, and transportation hubs. He's developing Deloitte's Smart Safe Cities strategy. He was formerly the Deputy Chief of the Toronto Police Service and a graduate of the FBI National Academy and a United Nations peacekeeper. So I'd invite the panelists to to come and take your places.
I'm just used to following rules, so I did whatever John told me to do. I blame Peter. But, so this is nice, a wood-paneled room with comfortable leather chairs. Kind of reminds me of City Council, a little. So we'll see how this goes. I'm used to being peppered with questions there. So good afternoon. Thank you very much. Enid, I'll try to do a good job here. When I received the invitation letter, I actually had to double check. Like, they wanted me? She actually, yeah, Tracey Cook, okay. So when we spoke as a panel, I said, well, what would you like me to talk about? And really it was the experience that I had and the City of Toronto had with Uber, Airbnb, and what disruption looks like. Usually, do I have to click, or is somebody clicking for me? Oh, from here? Okay. This is about technology. How am I doing so far? Usually when I say, what does disruption look like, I say I started out blonde and now I'm Uber silver. So this is what disruption looks like. So anyway, I'll give you a little bit of the history just to set some context in our past. So I'm going to primarily talk about our experience with Uber in the taxi industry. And, you know, the City of Toronto and most jurisdictions around the world have been regulating the taxi cab industry for decades. Some, I believe, we've been regulating since they were horse and carriage. I remember during the taxi review reading something about even Roman chariots in the 1600s were having the numbers restricted because of concern about congestion. So the history and experience of regulation over this type of private transportation system has been around forever. We in Toronto in February of 2014, so I got into this role January 2012. I'm almost 6 years, the end of this month, if I don't screw this up too badly. I'll be completing 6 years. And when I walked in, we were doing a taxi industry review. In February of 2014, and the date's important, I think, we brought a report to council that significantly made changes to the taxi industry and how we regulated. And one of the big focuses of that for us was enabling metered on-demand accessible taxi cab service. At that point, someone who had a mobility device and needed an accessible vehicle could not get one unmetered on-demand service. The accessible taxi cabs we had were all tied to Wheel-Trans. So we came out of the February 2014 review having made significant strides in moving that forward. We went from about 180 taxis all on Wheel-Trans to over 500, many of which were available for metered on-demand service. We're very, very proud of the work we had done. It was almost 2 years for me, body of work. And as I hadn't noted yet, but I will note now, apparently today is Robbie Burns Day. So all of those of you who are Scottish or like Scotch, cheers. I think haggis for dinner later. But one of the lines Robbie Burns said was, "The best laid plans of mice and men go often askew." And I thought, well, isn't that appropriate for what I'm talking about today? So February 2014, we bring a new bylaw. We've made great moves, huge reforms, enabled accessibility. September 2014, Uber launches UberX in the City of Toronto. 7 months, the ink's still not dry on our bylaw, and Uber starts with this level of disruption. So I did what all good regulators do. I said, oh, no, you're not. And our bylaws don't allow this, and this can't happen. And I'm former law enforcement as well, so I know my good friend Peter from. And you just don't come into my city and break rules like this. So off we go, seeking an injunction to stop Uber from operating. November of 2014, the day I announced that we had initiated the application for injunction, the same day I was in court defending the taxi cab bylaw we had just enacted in February of 2014. So I'm over in the courts on University with the taxi industry not particularly liking me. I come over to City Hall to say we've initiated an injunction against Uber, the taxi cab industry loving me, going back over after lunch, and the taxi cab industry not liking me again, but a little less because we had taken action against Uber. At that same time, very shortly thereafter, our mayor-elect, John Tory, was quoted in the paper saying Uber is here to stay. So I thought, well, this has been an interesting career thus far, but he was absolutely right. So, you know, right at that time, everybody was starting to talk about the sharing economy, and I do that in quotes when it relates to Uber because we all struggle with Uber fitting into that box of sharing economy, right? But for this purpose, they do. And I guess my turning point was a session by the Ontario Chamber of Commerce in March of 2015. And they released a report subsequently in May. I've just got a little picture of it up there, talking about the sharing economy and what was happening globally. So, when I've been asked before, how did I go from either Uber's not operating in this city, our bylaws don't permit it, to where I got to, which I'll talk about, like March 2015 is when I looked up. And I had been so entrenched in the rules and what we were doing and what we had done, and I didn't realize truly what was going on in this global phenomenon with disruption being driven by technology and putting the power of procuring services in a smartphone and in someone's hands. So that made a really big difference for us. We went through our injunction in July. We lost. That was fine. It was another turning point. And, really what it was the judge said the way we had defined things in our bylaw did not meet what Uber was providing, as they had purported in the courts. So now what are we going to do as a city? So we endeavored to and educate people and talk that, once we started realizing, myself and my staff, that this is a bigger thing, and Airbnb was on the rise as well, we need to start educating people. We held a sharing economy forum in October to try to get everybody else to look up with us. So that's where the dialogue started for us. The reality of disruption is where I think that's why Enid wanted me to be here, is to say, the face of the people who are impacted by the disruption, not just those who are using the service, but these photos are from the protests from the taxi cab industry in December of 2015. Everybody remembers the picture of the gentleman hanging on the car and totally tying up Queen and Bay. Our council chambers, there were a number of reports we brought on this topic. Council was rammed full of taxi industry folks. We had overflow rooms, and I'm sure you can get a sense of the pressure, the political pressure that put on our elected officials. And for us, the taxi industry had long had a protected industry. We limited the number of plates it could operate. They owned private ground transportation in the city, and that was being taken away in one fell swoop. At the same time, we had Airbnb. Very different dynamic. I spoke to Nabil, wherever you are, from York University, and we were talking about how Uber and Airbnb coming into the city, it was so different, and why was that? And there's a number of factors that contribute to that. But even with this, we have all the various sides, the people who want to be hosts and earn additional income, the people who are concerned, as we are, about the impact on affordable housing and what does that do. So we actually just got through the Airbnb regulations in November, just passed, and we're going to start implementing hopefully very soon. So the big ask for us was, when we're looking at how we regulate the taxi and limousine industry and Uber, is create a level playing field. And in one of the early consultations with the industry, I was asked, well, what does equal mean to you? What does equitable mean to you? And I said, and again, this level playing field, whose playing field and what level? So I found this picture of what a great way to depict equality, and then inclusion, which is where we landed, right? And you can see with equal, everybody gets the same thing. With equality or equity, everybody gets what they need. But what we decided and our approach was going to be is inclusion. And for us, removing the barrier that needed to be removed for everybody to participate was the regulation that we had crafted. So after 2 years prior and 7 months had just passed, or maybe almost a year at that point, we pretty much threw everything aside and started over again. And how could we create a regulation that would allow the taxi cab industry to operate in a new world? How could it make way for them to enable themselves with technology? One of the big pieces that contributed to this was our partnership with municipalities, jurisdictions around the world, and with Mars Solutions Lab. We did a body of work with them, and they were fantastic at facilitating many divided folks in the industry coming together to talk about potential solutions. And, I like how they articulated this trilemma of how, the effective regulation needing to provide public value, being mindful of how we administer it, and also enabling innovation. I was really pleased when folks from the OECD actually came and spoke to us and were a case study in one of their papers. We're talking about how we employed a systems approach to this public sector challenge. So Mars was a fantastic partner in that. As we went through it, and I think this is part of the discussions we're going to be having today, are the challenges we face. So simply, those who want to earn additional income driving Uber part-time, that flexibility, with the people who relied on it as a full-time employment that was potentially being eroded. How do we encourage innovation and manage everybody being included? There's some concerns raised, and there'll be time will tell, on the rating systems and whether that is or is not driving discriminatory practice. There's some indication that perhaps it is. So, how do we wrestle with all these things? So that was part of our challenge. So where am I today? And I'm sorry, Enid, I didn't watch the time. I'm hoping I'm close. So where we are today is at least our regulation got enacted in May of 2016, took effect in July. Uber was licensed in September 2016. Our last taxi protest was August 2016. And keeping my fingers crossed for that. And we've got a regulation that's working, and I think something that attests to that is the fact that Lyft, which is another ride-sharing company, the competitor to Uber in the US, chose Toronto as their first international expansion, and they're operating here as well. So, we'll see how everything rolls, but I'm pretty pleased with where we got. So having learned all that in going through the Uber Silver, as I say, or the protests and the pain, I found this depiction. I downloaded a book. This is like the first book I've ever downloaded. I'm just saying. I actually bought something off eBay once too. I'm so excited. Yes, I'm very technological. I'm joking. I've actually bought 2 things off eBay. But I saw this depiction, and it's Klaus Schwab, the executive director of the World Economic Forum. So I've downloaded his book. I'm going to look forward to reading that because we are in the 4th Industrial Revolution. But when I saw this transformation map, I just pulled out a few of the comments because I know it's very small to see. But I think it really is indicative of what the discussion is today, the promise and peril. Right, as we're thinking about innovation, we're thinking about enabling people with mobility, we have to ensure that we're addressing things such as our values and our employment insecurity, and what do we do with all of these different factors of what we're facing with technology and its impact. We've recently done a project with blockchain. We're starting, so as the City of Toronto, I think we're looking forward, and I'm glad to see our Chief Transformation Officer, Michael Combe, is here. Big fan, I am, by the way. I've almost become a stalker, I think, in a way. No, not really. No, I'm just bugging. We're at the same thing, 2 things the same today, so he thinks I'm following him. I'm actually following him because he's brilliant, and because he's talking about driving change in an organization that change hasn't often happened in. So I think as a city, we've learned going through the Uber experience the importance and the benefits of working collaboratively and problem solving. I think the lessons we've learned is that we need to embrace the change and find a way to manage it for the best for the people in our city, that we need to be curious and stay curious, and we need to look at what are we in for next and try to find a space to prepare for that. Those are the things we've learned. And at the end of the day, I think we just need to find some courage or keep that courage to know that we can make our way through things even when they're a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit awkward, but we can get there, and it's really that partnership that does it. So that was my experience. Set the context for the number of wonderful people we have here today to talk about, and thank you for your kind patience.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I really do appreciate it. It's a great chance. Oh, sorry. Oh. Much better. Better? Okay, better. All right. So thank you very much for having me here today. It's a great chance to be on such a wonderful panel. I wanted to use the time that I have today to talk about equity and inclusion in smart city design. So as you kind of get into the smart city space, one of the big questions, for me at least, is what's driving the marketplace and what's driving a lot of the enthusiasm around smart cities. And there's a couple of different points, right? If you talk to those inside government, there is the opportunity that they can improve service quality, reduce service costs, right? So we can save some money, we can make services better. Technology can perhaps do that for us. Then there is, of course, a bunch of different ranking systems out there, right? You can be one of the world's smartest cities. We all want to be a smart city. The opposite, of course, being a dumb city, and nobody wants to be a dumb city. We want to be smart. So there's things like the Smart City Challenge, which are external validation of some of the work that we, of course, are doing. So you can be a smart city. But in all of this, the one thing that I've noticed that doesn't get mentioned a lot are things like equity and inclusion. So there's a lot of enthusiasm about being able to remake cities using technology and to rethink how cities operate. And for me, if we have the opportunity to remake cities and to rethink them, we can probably put them on a more equitable foundation and create opportunity for people who don't currently have it. So I wanted to sort of capture this peril and promise theme, just give a couple of examples that I've noticed out there, and hopefully this can lead to our discussion later on today. So this is, of course, a Sidewalk Labs slide. I'm not going to talk too much about this individual project, but I think this is something that we've all come across. This particular picture here, I think, illustrates quite nicely what smart cities do. They kind of couple this sort of physical layer with a digital layer. And the physical layer is something that we're quite familiar with, right? We can govern it, we can plan for it, we can protect it, patrol it, and then regulate it. The digital layer, however, is a little bit harder to actually regulate and plan for. And with something like Sidewalk Labs, it mixes a bit of private space with public space. And around the city, where, of course, we confront public and private space all the time, right? Our residences and our workplace, of course, are private. You can't just sort of walk into someone's home and sit down, right? So we govern space along those lines. What Sidewalk Labs could potentially do, right? This is a community that will potentially react differently to those who are residents and those who work there and those who are not. We could potentially set up a situation where there's insiders and outsiders, and the city could potentially react differently based on your classification within one of those groups. The city gets to know you a bit. And this isn't something that's happening quite yet, but is perhaps something that could be happening in the future. We looked at Tel Aviv. Here we have something called Digital, and this is a very, very, very interesting initiative, and it essentially centralizes a whole bunch of government services onto an app. So whether you want to pay your property taxes or pay for a parking ticket, you can do it all in one app. Or if you want to find a concert or something like that going on, it's all right there. Part of this is also something called a citizen card, which stores a lot of information about you as you move around a city. It knows whether you're a transit user, whether you drive. It knows what sort of places that you frequent. It's designed to give you kind of a personalized experience with the city itself. So it knows what neighborhood you live in, and it can give you individualized alerts if there are things like road closures or if there's traffic problems, right? So it begins to kind of compartmentalize the city a bit. You can also input what you like to do. If you like Italian cuisine, it will notify you if there's a new Italian restaurant opening up, right? So I think it's something that's well-intentioned, of course, but it can perhaps lead to sort of a compartmentalization of the city itself into in-groups and out-groups. And this is, as I mentioned, something that's well-intentioned, but we can also see the more kind of aggressive patrolling of public space. This is a security robot, which has caught a little bit of attention recently. It was being used by the SPCA in San Francisco to essentially chase away homeless people from the sidewalks in front of their offices. So this is designed by a company called Nightscope, and you can rent it for $6 an hour. And it records video, it records audio, and it can interact with certain people. And it's used in some malls across the U.S. And it's as the SPCA showed, it can also be used to patrol public space and enforce a claim over public space that's adjoining privately owned businesses. So this thing weighs 400 pounds. There's an incident where it actually knocked over a toddler, so it's quite controversial. We'll see what happens with it, but this is quite an aggressive way to enforce your claim over public space. So just on the Peril and Promise theme, there is, of course, Promise. This is a app called Better Reykjavik. This is a participatory social network. Residents from Reykjavik can input ideas or identify problems with the city. And then other users can debate them and rank them, vote on them. And then every month, Reykjavik Council debates and votes on the top 10 to 15 issues, right? So it is a way to sort of put things on the agenda. With that said, we do know that there is a correlation between income and age and internet access, right? Those who are older tend to have less access, and those who are from lower income groups tend to have less access as well. And this is a trend that holds up for us here in Canada as well. And the same thing holds up with smartphone usage. So I know this is kind of hard hard to see. Those who are older and over 65 tend to own fewer smartphones than those who are younger, and those from lower income groups also tend to own smartphones at a lower rate. So some ideas that have sort of caught my eye, some things that we can potentially do here to sort of bridge the gap. We have a thing here called Link NYC. Those of us who have been to New York recently have probably seen these throughout the city. These are Wi-Fi hotspots and charging stations. They also have tablets attached to them, so you can access the internet right from these stations. So if you're a tourist, these things can be quite handy. But also, if you don't have access at home, you can log on and you can look for jobs or reach out to family, acquaintances right from these stations. They're mostly located within Manhattan. And of course, it's not an uncontroversial project. There is some concerns about the type of websites that people have been going onto on these tablets. There's some concern from tenants in some of these buildings that people tend to sort of camp out or loiter around these things as they're charging their phones. So it's not uncontroversial, but it is one idea and one way to increase access to the internet for certain groups. Also, we have here Smart Columbus. Columbus won the Smart City Challenge in the U.S. last year off the strength of their plan to essentially create a autonomous bus network to lower income parts of the city. And the whole idea there was to better connect those who are in lower income neighborhoods to the jobs that are available in the central city. So it's one idea. Again, it's not uncontroversial in that it hasn't started yet. They've actually been using some of the money to leverage more capital in their smart city plan. So it's not off the ground yet. But the whole idea about building equity into their city is something that won them the Smart City Challenge. And finally, here, I just want to note Digital C. This is an initiative in Cleveland. They are a group that is expressly operated to bridge the gap between lower and higher income groups within the city. And they have a program called Connect the Unconnected. The whole idea there is to provide broadband access to lower income neighborhoods throughout the city. They also have a tech startup within one of their businesses. One of their locations, sorry. And they also teach basic coding for children and those who may not have coding skills and want to get into the workforce. So just to sort of wrap up here, and I'm probably pretty close to being at time, I think that there, of course, is great promise with smart cities. We can create cities that are more sustainable, that are more open, have more opportunity. The peril, of course, is that if we don't think very deeply about who potentially might be excluded from some of these initiatives, we can potentially deepen inequality within our cities. So with that, I will end right there, and we'll move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
I'm much shorter than Zach. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot. I'm the third in a stream of 4 people, and what I'm going to focus on today is a discussion about some really practical and I think important considerations that we need to have when we think about what happens when we take new urban technology and we adopt it here. And I'm going to use the example of the new Sidewalk Labs proposal on Quayside, in part because it's pretty sexy. It's a 200-page document, and it reads like the greatest hits of urban planning. But what's really important, I think, about this project is that it's really the first time in our region we've seen a big, complicated urban technology program find a home in a place that we all know really well. And there's a big need to map that void, I think, between the complex, opaque, and really uncertain elements of urban technology and what they mean here in a city that we know and love, and one that we understand the people of and we can think about the impacts on. So I'm going to focus on Sidewalk Labs. So the first question I'm going to talk about is this question of who owns the data. And this is one that's really important for all of us to think about. And it's one of the ones I think that's received the most attention when the Sidewalk Labs piece started to land in Toronto. My research colleague, Tracey, who's the Canada Research Chair in Information and Technology and Governance at the University of Ottawa in the law school, wrote a really great op-ed really early on, and she asked some questions I think that are important for us to think about in terms of understanding who benefits and who may be at jeopardy when projects like this land. And one of the things that she talks about is that data ownership is one of the most important things that we need to understand in order to figure out whether there's going to be public good, private gain, or both from a project like this. And her caution in her op-ed in the Star is that the devil is always in the detail. And how will the data be shared, and with whom, and at what cost, and for how long will the data be kept? These kinds of questions aren't the kinds of things we'd had to think about with big urban development projects, but when we start to bring technology and data together, we need to start thinking more and longer and hard about it. And building on these questions comes next from someone who's in the audience, who she's going to kill me for pointing out. Bianca Wiley's here. She's an open data expert and a technology expert and an opinion writer about civic technology, open data, and civic engagement. And she frames some really important issues and concerns that arise when we ask the question about what happens when we don't have policy and law to guide innovation around technology that we don't understand. And this idea that we're trying to wrestle with things that we don't understand is really important. Quayside in the smart city piece looks simple compared to starting to think about things like artificial intelligence and what it means for our city. And so we're being forced as people who both work in policy and research and on the front line of service delivery to start to try to predict what the impacts are around complex technical systems that we don't have a precedent for. So we need to really think long and hard about what these systems mean and how they're going to impact people in the city that we care very much about. So it's time, I think, to start thinking harder about what are the terms and conditions under which the data is being gathered. And Quayside's not just any old neighborhood. It's going to be an amazing public space. I think Waterfront Toronto has a long-standing history of developing high-quality public space and high-quality urban development. But when we add the layer of data and technology on top of it, it becomes a whole new proposition. So as a planner, there are a bunch of practical things that I'm preoccupied with, because that's what we planners do. We think about practical things. And so one of the things I think we should think about is what happens next. So one of the things that we could do is we could ask the question, how do we make it easy for people to actually remember when they're in this space that there's a lot of data collection happening here? If you look at this mock-up of this waterfront development, it looks like a really great space, but it's not like every great space because there are other things happening. And so I've been wondering as a planner, what are the opportunities to use mobile phone technology, for example, to send push messages to remind people when they're in this space, they've entered a new kind of public space? And I've got public in quotes because things that happen in a data gathering urban landscape are different than what happens in spaces where the data is not being gathered. And we need to start to build, I think, awareness and competency in people's minds around how do we figure out what these things mean. I think the other reason why we need to push this kind of notification to people is that we talk about data like all data is created equal, and it's not. Some data has high value, some data is just silly and fun, and some data is of no value at all. But the data gathered, its value and its importance really depends on who it's being gathered from and how it's being used. And this is a really important differentiation, I think. Data is a plural noun, and we need to start talking about it in a way where we recognize its plurality. The data from someone who's economically marginalized or a racialized person that's gathered may have different value and meaning to them than someone who's affluent, all right, who has no other challenges that they're facing in their life. So we can't talk about data like it's one big thing. We have to start differentiating between the elements of data and what it means in terms of the work that we're doing. The other thing I think that we need to remind ourselves about is that this Quayside project represents an amazing opportunity for innovation and experimentation. And in my world as an academic, when we experiment on people, we have to go to this place called the Research Ethics Board, okay? How many professors are there in the room? We all revere and fear the Research Ethics Board. And the role of the Research Ethics Board is to make sure that our research doesn't do any harm to people. Okay, and their job is to help mitigate risk. We're supposed to make sure that when we do research with real people, that our research doesn't leave them worse off than when we found them. And I think that there's a parallel that we need to think about in the kinds of urban experiments that we're thinking about having in the city of Toronto. And so one of the questions I've been noodling on for a while is, if I download an app, I have to sign a terms of service, right? I can't use the app until I agree to the terms that the software provider is using. What if we started having a conversation in Toronto where we thought about what's our collective citizen terms of service? If people want to come and do stuff with us and use our data, what are our terms of use? What are our expectations? What are our hopes and what are our goals? And what do we need in return? Because there's a reciprocity here, right? Companies are going to come and gather data from us, and we're going to be subjects, and there may be things that we benefit from, but we may also have asks that we want to make in return, and we haven't started to have that conversation, and that's important, I think. So I think it's a civic parallel discussion that needs to start to happen. We also need to have this conversation because we need to understand which ones of us amongst us are more vulnerable in certain data gathering situations in new urban experiments and which ones aren't. In my world, we talk a lot with our students about how you have to fail to learn. Well, the capacity to fail in an experimental environment is much more easily borne by someone, for example, who has stable housing and access to food and good employment. But the poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are, you don't have the option of failure, okay? You may not want to choose to run the risk of the kinds of experiments that may be run. And what we need is an environment in which citizens are making informed choices about the kinds of things they're willing to participate in. And these are really important conversations. And I'm fleshing them out based on Quayside, but these are relevant based on all of the new technological innovations that are coming. So I think there are things that we really need to consider here and that we need to work our way through if we're going to have an ethical approach to the way in which we work. I'll end by saying that one of the things about Toronto that we also need to get better at acknowledging is that we are a city whose story is one of change. Okay, our change of the city, I've been here for 20 years. This city has drastically changed in the 20 years I've been here. And those of you who've been here longer probably see the change in very important and significant ways. And so we can't use our old ways of governing to govern this new changing landscape. We need to build new civic processes, and we need to think about new kinds of questions to ask so that we can get ready. And I don't want these questions to be cast as being any way change averse. One of the things that's interesting is that for those of us who've been commenting on this project early on, the minute you start asking questions, you immediately get branded as a skeptic. And I bristle at the skeptic label in part because that's not the intent. This isn't a change-resistant mindset. I'm a planner and I'm an academic, and it's my job to ask questions on behalf of the public interest. And what we need to start having in a more direct, robust, and inclusive way is a bigger public discussion about what this change means for us. How do we change in ways that are inclusive? David Holchansky, wave your hand. David's in the back. David's done an amazing job in Toronto mapping that we are not one city but many cities. We need to understand how this kind of technology maps itself on to all of the people of Toronto, and we need to start asking more people what they desire from this technology, but what their fears are, and how public institutions can start to help them mitigate the risk that they're maybe assuming, along with reaping the benefits as they come from the technology. Thank you.
Starting to feel like a 40-watt bulb in a 100-watt chandelier with former speakers. Deeply honored and humbled to have a chance to come and talk about a very complex subject, well beyond my ability. So I'll just try to add some perspective, a little bit of lived experience and some professional experience as well in what is my third career. Tracey, you and I are trading a lot of badges along the way. So I'm going to try to bring in a little bit more of the security and safety piece into the conversation, although it's been very well touched on directly and indirectly in this piece. You know, the genie's out of the bottle, unfortunately, and there's no putting big data or analytics or cognitive AI back in. It's out there. It's probably on many of your wrists if you're wearing a Fitbit. There's no doubt the CCTV cameras that are in this facility have already got you onto some sort of facial recognition database that'll be utilized at some point down the road. And if you have an Apple iPhone like I do, it's listening to you all the time, whether you have it on or not anyway. So the definition of public space is no longer really public-private. The devices you have on you and in your home and in your car are monitoring you, sensorizing you, profiling you, segregating you, compartmentalizing you, utilizing you, monetizing you all the time, every day, everywhere around the world. So the concept of public-private for me is long gone. It's now how do we live in the new normal? So let me get into my little thoughts. Smart cities, you can't have a smart city unless you have a safe city, and you can't have a safe city unless it's more smart than dumb. I love that we don't want to be a dumb city piece. And whether you voluntarily provide data into the system or the system picks up your data involuntarily, and whether you live in one of the top 10 smartest cities or you live in a very remote rural village somewhere in the third world where there are cell phone access almost at the same level that we have and increasingly more so, everywhere is being turned on and everywhere is getting smarter. I'm just not sure we're getting more wise in the use of it. Smart Cities 3.0, you might wonder why. Cascais, Portugal is a city about the size of Oakville. It sits outside of Lisbon, one of the smarter cities at that size. And I love what they talked about. The first version, 1.0, was technology application. The second version of it was mining the data. And the third version of it is giving the data back over to the community and allowing them to leverage it at the highest level, as much or more so than any other stakeholder. So that was the 3.0 reference there. Courageous cops. I spent a lot of time in policing. I have a bit of a reputation for criticizing policing. I think I'm a bit like you. I just want the best brand of policing out there, and if I seem to be critical of my former colleagues, it's because I wanted us to go from good to great, and in some cases from bad to better. But I'm not ashamed to say that the vast majority of my former colleagues and current men and women working out there in various forms of policing are courageous. And like the average citizen, they are the average citizen. And they are subject to data and privacy issues. They're subject to profiling and segregation, and they're subject to victimization on the scale as a private citizen, and even to a greater scale when they put on that uniform and go into work. And they're also going to be at the front line of whatever comes out of regulation and legislation as it relates to enforcing and maintaining public order and law in the current state and as we transition to the future state. And they have as many and probably more questions about what their role is as a public official, as a private citizen. And so I take to heart this topic because of my former role and because of my role supporting these organizations going forward. Never mind that robot that you saw in the previous. This is the robot of now. It's a cobot. It's a cop cobot. So let me walk you down what's here. Biometrics. We're going to be putting onto our officers, if they're not already wearing their own Fitbit, the ability to track their heart rate and their vital signs should they be wounded and alone or unable to be found, so we can start to triage their circumstances and send a paramedic unit to be able to save their lives. I've been at too many police funerals where if we had that type of technology, we might have been able to stop that officer from dying. And too many other funerals of members of the community where if we had the ability to get biometrics onto a person who is in extreme trauma, we might be able to actually get the right medical treatment and save many of the homicides that we have in this city and many other cities. We have nanotechnology in the uniforms that allow them to be lighter weight and much more protective, not just against ballistic firearms, but against edged weapons, against blunt force trauma, which is usually the main reason why an officer loses their life. We have exoskeletons. And by the way, this isn't science fiction. Every one of these things have been field tested somewhere in a military exercise and in many police services around the world. So an exoskeleton that would take a guy like me that came on the job with 2 herniated discs and 12 years in was on my second back surgery and allow me to be fitted out with an exoskeleton so that I could still chase 16-year-olds over fences when I was a 52-year-old person like I am today. So instead of investing $100,000 a year into a city asset that 10 years in has a bad back, and now you have to keep on the public dole for another 25 years, you can actually get a full return on the investment. Obviously smartphones and connected ability, but augmented reality and virtual reality through the Google goggles or whatever version of headwear that you'd put on. Sensors on the weapons. So every time you reach for your stick or your OC spray or for your gun, first of all, it recognizes you as the individual that has the right to pull that trigger and the responsibility, and can also track whether or not you're actually putting in the required paperwork after the fact because you actually did have your gun out. Instead of nobody's around to see it, we can actually track through sensors. Body-worn cameras, in-car cameras, cameras everywhere, obviously. Greater accountability, greater behavior modification. And most importantly for me, all those things are connected into artificial intelligence, big data, cognitive AI, and are allowing the officer in near real time to surveil the world around them to the deepest and most extensive case possible to look for threats, possible victimization for the earliest intervention with the lowest level of force and disruption to the community. An amazing set of potential realities. And this is going to be walking your streets far before you see those little R2-D2 droids walking around out there. All right, now add that into a security operations center, layer on a few more bells and whistles in terms of software, hardware, and big screens, put them at City Hall, at 40 College Street, up at 703 Don Mills, and a bunch of other places, and we can do mass surveillance for all sorts of good reasons and all sorts of potentially not so good reasons and all sorts of great outcomes and all sorts of potentially not so great outcomes. Big data for better public safety or for worse private protections. Which way will it go? Some great examples. Here's big data bias. Every one of the algorithms written by every single AI operating system out there was written by some combination of human beings. I'm not aware that we've reached singularity, so I'm assuming that human beings sitting down in small groups write algorithms. Every one of us in this room, unless there's an alien in here, has a set of personal biases. I assume there's no one in here that will deny that you have personal biases. Therefore, when you write your algorithm, even if you've gone through the school of ethics, those biases are going to show up. And if they show up in an individual, that's one set of impacts. If it shows up into an AI system with the power of technology behind it, it exponentially creates the positive and the negatives that come out from those biases. That's why when Geophidia was set up with its AI to help many major urban centers in the US do open source social media monitoring to assess gun and gang and drug related threats in those communities, it started to point more and more towards racialized communities. And it started to produce unintended outcomes of over-policing, excessive use of force, which really didn't, quite frankly, impact the actual thing it was supposed to, which is public safety and public spaces. And so eventually they realized that the AI impact through Geophidia was having a negative outcome. The government stepped in and actually said public agencies can no longer provide the data into those systems. Once Geophidia was choked of that information, it couldn't continue to generate, and so it went out of business in those areas. There is a very specific impact, unintended outcome of private and public partnerships around something that was intended to be good and wasn't so good. Across Canada, we've seen the issue of racial profiling, carding, street checks, whatever you want to call it. Again, it's a data collection system designed to create public safety and public spaces. Once people let that genie out of the bottle, technology came in and allowed us to go from, in some cases, some major centers were putting in a couple thousand of these things a year. In some cases, went up to over 800, almost 1 million of these contact cards going in. Massive data with very little thought around privacy, data management, the implications of profiling, segregation, prioritization of where police services would go or not go, and how they'd be treated. It caused a huge amount of legitimacy and public trust issues right across this country that police agencies and members of the public are still living through. Who owns that data? A question is still being asked by people, well, if it's been proven to be less than effectual, can I have my stuff back? Well, actually, no, you can't have it back because we still might be able to use it. So this debate rages on. Dale McPhee, former police chief of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, rural community, mostly Aboriginal, less than 100,000 population, less than 100 police officers. Dale McPhee is now the Justice Minister, Deputy Minister of Justice for the province of Saskatchewan. He started to think about different ways that we could produce public safety without involving the criminal justice system, without use of force, without victimizing people who already have been victimized by many different things, including alcohol, mental health addictions, et cetera, et cetera. And he came up with the idea of an application of an integrated service delivery model, where we would look at individuals of high risk who are suffering from a number of things, who are showing signs, pre-criminal signs of problems, provide wraparound services, public health, public education, local not-for-profits, and yes, the police, to really identify what the problems were underlying and come up with a customized preventative solution. He didn't come up with the idea. It had been researched and piloted in the US. It had been mainstreamed over in Glasgow in the UK. He set up the first integrated hub service delivery model in Canada. It relies on not just carrying professionals, but it relies on the collection and sharing of data. Health data, education data, your income data, the things that are really indicators of whether or not you're going to become a victim of some different form of risk. And when you shared that data amongst professionals, you could actually come to a better solution. And the majority of the solutions did not require the person to go into the criminal justice system. Dale applied this at the provincial level. Those of you that are from the healthcare system will understand these stats. 1% of the people in the criminal justice system in Saskatchewan are responsible for 70% of the costs. 80% of the reason why that 1% are in there are mental health and addictions. Dale McPhee went to his premier and said, because of the data, I can tell you, you don't have a crime and justice problem, you have a health problem. And we can save hundreds of millions of dollars in Saskatchewan that can be reinvested and reallocated into upstream programs like education and health. Almost finished there, John, don't pull me off. Anne Kavukian, Privacy Commissioner here in Ontario. We had the pleasure of working, Deloitte had the pleasure of working with her to help her design privacy by design as a methodology. This is at the heart of what we must do in any experiment going on in this city or any other city. Sidewalk Labs, I am sure, has already been, actually I believe she is advising Sidewalk Labs on a privacy by design approach, critically important. And whether it's a small program by the local constabulary or a large 141st neighborhood in the city of Toronto, this has to be at the heart of everything that we do, not just in the design, but in the implementation and in the evaluation. At Deloitte, when it comes to cybersecurity, and again, big data can be leaked, usually leaked from people inside the organization. By the way, the new Chief Innovation Officer. Your biggest threat is your employee base. My biggest threat in Deloitte is our employee base, because 60 to 70% of all your physical and cyber threats come from inside your own organization. Think about your own families. It's not people breaking in to steal your data. It's your daughter who doesn't use proper passcodes, or your parents who don't even have a password, that are allowing their information to get out there. So you can wait for the big bad nation state to come in, or you can just look at your own folks and get some hygiene in there and protect yourself. So you need to be secure, vigilant, and resilient. Secure your data, be vigilant because people will be trying to get it from you, and then be resilient because it's not a matter of if, but when you are breached and how bad it will be, how quickly you can respond to it and move on. And so security by design, both in the physical world and in the cyber world, involving people that are inside your house, inside your organization, inside City Hall, as well as the people and organizations that are part of your ecosystem. I just mapped out your typical police organization because I use this mainly when I talk to police agencies, but this could be the City of Toronto, or it could be Sidewalk Labs neighborhood. You've got to think in terms of ecosystems and Venn diagrams. You have to think in both terms of the physical and the cyber. We're in the world of IoT. There's no such thing as a divided space. It's just a fully integrated reality from here on in. Tracey, love you to death, sister. When you used the word courage, I went, yes, that's why I love you. So this is my friend and mentor, former commissioner of the Philadelphia Police. He was the chief of Washington, D.C. when one of the planes hit the Pentagon, and he was also a senior officer in Chicago PD, just retired a year ago. For me, pound for pound, the best police leader I've ever seen in the Western world. And he said, when it comes to policing, it's not about more security, more force, more cops, more anything. It's about us changing our culture and approach the way we see ourselves. So rather than being a thin blue line, we need to be a thin thread that is woven into the fabric of society. Data is woven into everything that we do. We give it out, we leak it out, it's taken away from us, it's utilized. It's not us versus them, it's not us versus big data, big cops, big brother. This is just us. So how do us get along with us and manage us better? Courage was the word you used. Courage is what I'm going to leave off on. Deloitte did a review of the best companies in Canada and what made them the best. And singularly, the one issue that differentiated one company that was good and one that was great was the issue of courage. And courage is defined by starting with yourself and just challenging ourselves. Are we the best version of who we can be? And do we have biases? And are they leaking into our work and into our views and into our policy making? Challenge the status quo. I love when you said, I woke up in March and I went, whoa, this is happening around the world. I've been stuck in regulation. I need to think about disruption. So challenge the status quo. Take calculated risks. With all this big data, there is very little big certainty. You are not going to have perfect information to make perfect decisions. So you're going to have to take a leap of faith. Do what's right. At the end of the day, do what's right. You're never going to get it right all the time, but you got to try to do what's right. There will be unintended outcomes every single time. Admit the mistakes, make the changes, and move on. Don't defend the indefensible. And unite to include. Inclusion was another big theme that came out today. None of us is an expert in this area. I challenge anybody in the room to stand up and say, you are an expert on cybersecurity, physical security, policing, privacy. That doesn't exist. The world changes every single day. You are as an expert for the crisis you just dealt with, and you have nothing really to contribute to the next one coming around the corner. So we're all in the learning business. We all have to go back to ethics school, and we're all going to have to work together to make this a better and brighter future, make sure the next generation benefits and doesn't lose as a result of this amazing world. Thanks.
So in all of the, so I'm going to ask one question of the panelists, and they can discuss it a little bit, and then I'll ask the audience for questions. So in all of your presentations, you kind of touch on this, what seems to me to be the elephant in the room, which is this whole question about data governance. And so and this is a topic which the Sidewalk Labs proposal has sort of brought to the fore. You know, we're creating, as the company says, a community from, built on the internet. And it raises all sorts of interesting questions about, who owns data collected in the public sphere, how is it used, and how is it overseen? And so in urban spaces, and looking at all of your domains, you've all touched on some of the big questions about governance. So I'd like you to sort of talk about about this problem of how do you provide accountable governance to citizens without the technical chops to appreciate all of these systems that are in place, and and yet apply the skepticism that's required to to create a system that's humane and inclusive and not overly dependent on technological assurances. So maybe I'll start with you, because you're in the governance business.
Wow, can I get somebody to interpret everything you just asked me, John? So, on the point of data governance, I think that is, and Peter ended with we're in the learning business, and that is wholly true. So, for example, and sorry, I keep diverting back to Uber, but we've set up a system where we are collecting significant volumes of data. Every single trip that's taken in the city of Toronto, we actually receive. Now, we were very conscientious, I believe, when we set out what the data requirements that we were imposing, because of that interest of privacy and ensuring that we didn't take more than what we needed for the purposes that we needed it for. So we've got a lot, and we're actually refining as we go. Example was when we started taking trip data, and it was being given at latitude, longitude, down to a certain number of decimal points, that we actually realized that we were pinpointing people. We didn't know who, right? There's no names, no passenger data. We're very careful on that, but we actually had almost within inches of where pickups and drop-offs were happening in the city, and we thought, I don't think we need that much detail. Let's reframe, and we stepped back, right? So on the issue of data governance, I think understanding what we're asking for, how we're getting it, but we're still learning. We're talking now about open data quite a bit, and I do firmly believe there's a ton of opportunity for us to leverage the use of data in making business decisions for the city. We're working on that with our apartment building program, where we can target risk-based audits based on data that we're able to collect and manipulate, and something that I want to push back out to the public so they can make informed tenancy decisions when we get to that point. But I think we've still got a ways to go on what we do with what we have, what we ask to collect, just because we can, should we, and then how we put that, to your point, how do you put that to the best use to serve the public interest, which is what we're here for. I don't have wholly the answer. I think Zach might.
All right, it's a bit of pressure. I don't think I do have the answer, so I'm probably going to pass the buck at the end of this to these two. But I would say definitely, I think it's tough to say how to get the right policies around data. I mean, I think Peter had an excellent point that if it's woven into our daily lives, right? So how do we ensure that what's being taken is being used in an ethical and appropriate way? With smart cities, it's more challenging because they feed on data. The whole thing, it needs that information to be successful, to be responsive to the people around it. And so people designing smart cities will probably say, well, we can't sit there and ask permission every time that we want to take something from you. We just need it, and then we're going to use that to build a city that's responsive to you, so we can monitor resource levels and make a smart city smart. So a smart city can't be smart without the data. So we're in this kind of conundrum, I think. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Pamela.
Thanks, Zach. For me, the question on data governance starts with the question, what's the civic or the public interest in the gathering of the data, but also what are our liabilities as well, and who do we need to reach out to start to build a robust understanding of that picture? New York City, I think, is leading right now. They have a new task force on algorithmic governance, which is a pretty woolly-headed way of saying the math that's going to be used to crunch the data. And just yesterday, a whole suite of civil society groups wrote a memo to the city framing who needs to participate in this task force. And it goes back to the point that I'll give credit to Bianca about, which is how do we govern technology that we don't understand? So what we need to build, and we can't even wait for policy or legislation, we need to get this stuff on the ground right now, we need to pilot it. How do we start to build our capacity to get our heads around a rapidly evolving technological environment and what it means for the public good? So that would be the first thing that I would say. And the other thing I think we need to think about around data governance is that we haven't really given it much discussion, and maybe the Chief Innovation Officer for the city can talk about this later, but there's real pressure from the tech sector and from digital governance movements to start to have what we call lean policy environments, policy that reiterates in real time which is a pace at which governments don't work at all right now. Hey, Gabe. And so we don't see this kind of work or this kind of mindset. And we haven't trained public servants to reiterate policy in real time, right? Policy is slow, and not all policy should reiterate in real time, but this pressure is coming. And so we have technological pressure, we've got complexity and uncertainty around the data, and then we've got other things changing in the society around us. So we need a governance shakeup, but I think we don't need to wait for the perfect. We need to start piloting things right now, really, that help us understand what's coming and how we're going to deal with it.
Try to add add to the problem. I had a meeting with some of the heads of the Ryerson Digital Media Zone. We were talking about another big data gathering. And I said, when you bring new startups in, you teach them a whole bunch of technology, business acceleration. Do you teach them about ethics and in terms of using privacy by design? Oh, no, we do, but it's kind of towards the end. It's kind of optional. When I did my MBA, it was the same thing. We got a whole bunch of financial accounting techniques, and then sort of near the end of 3 years, they gave you the optional ethics course. I don't think that's optional. Now, the pushback from them was, well, if we slow down their development process, every day counts to when they get a minimal viable product out the door in order to get investment. And if we slow them down, then somebody in Silicon Valley beats them with the IP. And we're talking about not a couple $100,000, we're talking about potentially a couple $100 million that don't get generated. So there's a structural problem around slowing down the pace, getting ethics and governance into innovation and into legislation, which makes you non-competitive. Now let me go to the solution side. I'm not sure we're going to come up with it, but I'm pretty sure my 3-year-old and my 11-year-old has got a better chance. But what I really want to see in preschool and grade school and high school and post-secondary is digital ethics, governance, maybe not worded like that, but have that next generation who are about to become the next CEOs and CIOs and chief everything-os, having grown up with that in their DNA, so that when we have to force ourselves to think this way, when we're forcing ourselves to learn in different ways to do things differently, it's entirely natural to them. I'm pretty sure our generation has missed it. The next generation is where I would place most effort.
Thank you. I'm just going to go over there and call on questions. Who's got a question? Yes.
My name is Michael. I'm a near 80-year-old resident of Toronto, so I've experienced Toronto's changes many times. Right now, I don't think it's changing for the better. I'd like to relate an experience in the mid-'80s when I was editor of a construction magazine and went to an event for builders, and a gentleman then had something of a guru for the construction industry, actually working both sides of the fence, the industry and then the population, told the members or the attendees that he had asked CMHC to pull together stats to reinforce his argument. So he was actually asking CMHC to customize to his specifications the statistics. I've never forgotten that. The past several years I've been involved in planning in terms of participating, reviewing, critiquing various condo developments. And maybe I'm a cynic, journalist or whatever, but I think we are a city where we're one-dimensional, that it's the development industry that's controlling our future and the way we go.
Do you have a question at the end of this?
Well, yes. The point is, how do you control how the information where you're all pulling together is accessed? Who gets to use the information, and how do you ensure the information is used as it's supposed to be? Okay.
That's a great question. So I'm going to open it up. Tracey, why don't you begin, because you left off on this point. How do you make sure that it's used appropriately?
Yeah, so, and I think this ties, we were talking about data governance and use of data, but with the city, we've got a big push on open data, right? And making sure to the fullest extent possible, the information that we do have, the data that we have is available for public use and to be put together and utilized however people so choose. I think, you know, the transparency of the data is key to understanding how people are using it. If someone holds it all, and isn't it the accountant's trick? What do you want it to say? I think that's, you know, that you're alluding to. But if the data is out there for everyone, then you're going to address that issue of how it's being used, what's being used, the reliability of it, and the transparency. So I think the moves that we're making, at least on the open data front, is definitely in the fore for us. We need to do a lot of work on the technology side, I think, to enable that as well. But I just think transparency and access to clean, reliable data sets is part of the answer to that.
Okay, so let me ask a follow-up to Pamela. With open data, it's available to all sorts of people, including people who might be looking to commercialize data that's gathered in the public realm. And so this comes back to the question of governance. So how do you, so somebody walks down the sidewalk, that's captured in some way, turns up as a little smidgen of data, and it's monetized. How do we think through that in terms of governance and all of these issues?
Well, I think, you know, that's where we have to start to build the civic conversation about what kinds of data are being gathered under what terms and for what uses. And so some of the data might be really benign, and, you know, the open data portals are interesting places. I don't know how many of you have ever investigated one or spent time on one, but, you know, there's some weird and wonderful stuff in there, like pet names, but then also things like where the bike lanes are, right? And so not all the data sets are created equal, and ideally what we're working towards are civically useful and important data sets so that we can advance the capacity to do good things from the data analysis. So John, to your specific question, it's hard to know about that one data set, but the volume of data that's going to be possible to be collected in the conditions that we're already collecting, we need to start getting better at building our collective intelligence about which data sets we need to pay more attention to and which ones are okay. The tricky part is when you start mashing them all together. They may look benign discretely, but if you put 6 of them together and then map them, then new things can happen. So we need a responsive dynamic system to start to do this kind of evaluation, and we've got to start to build it soon. But the other bit I'll just say is the data quality piece matters. And we haven't really talked about, you talked about it a little bit about how algorithms have bias. The other thing is that data has bias. And if the machine learns from crappy data, then the machine's going to do really bad analysis, or it's going to do dangerous or unethical analysis. And so it's not just the quality of the stuff that's on the portal, but it's the data we're using to train the machines to do the stuff, which is, to me, it's the stuff I think about when I can't sleep. So, yeah.
The gentleman here.
Observations, and hopefully 2 quick observations, and hopefully you'll have higher quality observations about them. First one is, we have to make this.
It's on.
Do we have to make this hipper? It has to be curated, this information. Nobody except some dedicated researchers and academics are going to chew into all this data. In the same way that there's like 5,000 great podcasts going on all the time, and I have no idea where to begin listening to it, but Matt Galloway and his journalist partner have a great little show, and I get cranked about things I'd never heard of before. It's sort of like the oral New Yorker. So how do we get people interested in those things? That's one. The second one is, sometimes we think of data as a way of improving some other activity, but we can miss the original purpose, and Peter, you'll appreciate this. A very classic example is we put people on probation orders and bail conditions and whatnot, and it says you can't go here, you can't go there, you can only go here between this hour and that hour. And what we really mean is don't do that and get caught. And that's the functional standard, right? Don't make anyone complain about you. If you go to the corner at 8:30 for cigarettes and your curfew is 7, we don't care. But if we register your Fitbit with the probation service, it's going to be somebody's job to arrest you on the way home from the corner store. That wasn't our intention. So we're going to have to, I think, rethink the level of regulation and the language we use in other ways in order to make good use of this capacity. Thank you. Love to hear you say something much more intelligent about it.
Any takers? The law of unintended consequences with data gathering?
Sure. I could just sort of touch on the first one there about how do you get people interested in this. I think when you talk to people about data gathering and ownership, and you explain to them, how much information is really being taken from, you kind of get one of two reactions. The first is kind of outrage. You're like, oh my God, like Instagram takes all this stuff from my phone, and like how could this be? The other one is people just, who cares? There's so much being taken from me. It's going to this this sea of data out there, and I'm not all that interesting anyways. Who cares if my phone knows if I'm using the bus or driving, whatever, right? But I think with that second group, it's not a concern, right? With the first group, it's that if you let them know what's actually being taken, because the knowledge about data collection is so low amongst the public. I mean, a lot of people are just they're horrified when you tell them, right? So I think just making it known and making people aware, I think, is the first step. And we don't educate people along those lines very well, I don't think. So I don't know if that's helpful to you, but
I have time for one more question. I'm going to choose. One very quick.
Municipalities feel an increased pressure to educate the public on data governance, collection, and things like that? For example, Transform TO. Is there any money set aside for public education in that realm?
Okay, so I have 1 minute for the answer. I'm going to ask Tracey.
So I think a lot of the focus on what we're doing is try and get more information, usable information out to the public and curated or in themes around what interests people. I mentioned my apartment building program that we want to be able to take all the data from internally with the city, put it together to something that's usable for the public to see. Are we there yet? No. Are we aware that it's absolutely critical that we're using the data that we have and the data that we're going to be having, and Pamela's point about the vast volumes of data that we are going to be inheriting over time soon? What are we doing with it? I absolutely believe that the desire of the city is to really drive engagement with the public, and that's through empowerment of the public and by informing the public. So, I know when we talk about any of the consultation work or any of the implementations that we do, that public engagement piece and learning how to engage the public more fully is front and center. And that includes that communication of what we're doing. A great example, I'm going to call out Michael again, unfortunately. Sorry, buddy. But he's in charge of launching our Smart Cities Challenge for the City of Toronto. And one of the things that Michael's doing, I think using Mars as well, but reaching out into the public domain, not just asking a bunch of people at the city who work here, what do you think we should do? Like engaging the public at this ground level in every corner of the city that they can, and every type of group that wants to pull together to say, what do you want to see from us? And I'm sure that this is going to be coming out. People have a right and an interest to know what their city is doing, what it means to them, how they can benefit by what we're doing, or where we're aware of their needs. So I think we're getting a lot better. I think we need to break down plain language. It drives me absolutely insane, especially being in a legal context. We love spouting bylaw language, this and that. We need to articulate things in plain language. And I do believe that is a desire of all of us at the city, is to get much better at that. And I hope I answered your question. Okay.
I'm going to ask David Wolf to come up and thank the speakers. I know there are still other questions. Perhaps you can buttonhole one of the speakers, but
So I'm David Wolf, the co-director of the Innovation Policy Lab and the co-sponsor of this session with the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance. I love co-sponsoring events with IMFG because they run like clockwork, and I have to do next to nothing. So I want to thank Enid, Selena, Jamila, the staff of IMFG for a great panel, expertly organized. I want to thank everybody who came out and listened attentively, a great audience. Most of all, I want to thank our 4 panelists for really stimulating presentations. I have a simple criteria for a successful event, a seminar, a panel, whatever. If I go into an event thinking I know a fair bit about the topic, and I come out of it an hour and a half later realizing what Peter said, that I knew next to nothing, that my expertise is not just a day old, but several months or years old, then that to me is a really successful panel. And this one succeeded, beyond my expectations. I think we're all really in your debt for 4 short, pointed, but really information-filled and stimulating talks. I think it's a testament also to your draw that we have some people in the audience from the city, from Waterfront Toronto, who are actively working on and engaged with these issues, and that they came out and wanted to hear what you had to say. And finally, Tracey, welcome to our house. You're more than welcome to come back. And I always find that, when I sit in this wood-paneled room and listen to really intelligent presenters, it makes me feel smarter. I don't know if the city's smarter, but I certainly feel a lot smarter. So thank you to you all.